Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you tonight. You know, Martin Luther King said, is this loud enough? Is this better? Martin Luther King said, our lives begin to end on the day we stop talking about things that matter. You know, one of the things I like speaking, why I like speaking in churches, yoga studios, places like that, is because a deeper level of conversation is accepted and understood. We all know the line from Einstein that we would not solve the problems of the world from the level of thinking we were at when we created them. And I think even though we all intuitively know there's truth there, I think we need to ask ourselves, well, what is the kind of thinking that we have to embrace in order to solve the problems that are so clearly among us? You know, Mahatma Gandhi said, politics should be sacred. And when he said that, clearly he wasn't saying it should be religious doctrine or dogma. That's not what he meant at all. He meant that when we inhabit the space of political conversation, political activism, we should be coming from a deeper place within ourselves. That place where we go in intimate relationships, conversations, therapy, religious ceremony, that place which isn't just about a brain cut off from the heart, but a brain that is aligned with the heart. You know, there is a neurosurgeon at Stanford University, James Doty. Dr. Doty has written about the fact that while they used to think that the brain was the intelligence center of the body, they now realize that there is more of a highway, more of a partnership between brain and heart than there used to be, than they used to think. And that this partnership between brain and heart, that combination is the intelligence center of the body. And I think that we need to start thinking about the brain and the heart as the correct alignment for correct politics in society as well. Right now, our political system, what I call our political media industrial complex, is as shallow a conduit for conversation as you can imagine. It is a corrupted vessel. It is not a channel for deep or meaningful conversation about things that matter most. And there's a reason for that. It doesn't serve those who dominate that space for we the people to have a serious, in-depth conversation. Now, on one hand, we realize this, and that's why so many of us look at politics and think, oh, it's so toxic, I don't want anything to do with it. But we also, having been through so much, we've been through 9/11, we've been through COVID, we've been through the Trump presidency, the divisiveness, we've been through January 6th. We've seen so much damage to our environment. We see foreign wars, the horrors that are so obvious. Enough of us now realize something's got to change. And even though we don't want to go back into that toxic space of traditional political establishment activism, at the same time, we know that we've got to come up with something. Now, it's interesting because if you took any two people who are here tonight, two people who don't know one another, and said, you guys go out to dinner later, okay? I think it's reasonable to assume that within 30 minutes, you'd both know which of you was in therapy, which one of you had been through traumatic experiences in your life, which of you were in toxic relationships right now, and you really, really need to practice more self-care and draw a boundary or two. We're really good now about analyzing ourselves. We're very used now to in-depth conversations about me. But when it comes to collective conversations, political conversations about things that matter the most to our country, to our world, and to our future, we've been trained to think like sixth graders. We've been trained to farm out our own best thinking. And we have farmed it out to the people who were the last people we should be farming it out to. We have farmed it out to people that we unthinkingly assumed had our best interests at heart. And anybody who still thinks that, I can't imagine what you're thinking. Because if you want to talk about a boundary that maybe you should set, if you want to talk about an abusive relationship that maybe you need to handle, think about your relationship, how abusive it is with a government that allows there to be carcinogens in the food that you feed to your children that would not be allowed in any other major democracy. What about that for an abusive relationship? And so we have to recognize that if any of this is going to change, it's going to be we, the people, who change it. And I think that to some extent, we have to take responsibility for the fact that it ever got this way. You know, a lot of people think that Americans are apathetic, and that's not my experience at all. I don't think people are apathetic. I don't think tonight, looking out at you, just the same as I feel when I look back at any other audience around the country on this campaign, you don't look apathetic to me. You look like you're probably concerned, and you should be. The issue is not that people are apathetic today, it's that nobody can believe that this is happening. Nobody, it's like, well, how did it get this bad? And so I think we need to embrace the kind of thinking that will truly allow us to analyze deeply enough to dismantle what's going on, to deconstruct what's happened here, so that we can be as powerful players in the transformation that needs to occur as possible. Now, I'd like to start tonight with our history. You know, every generation, just like every individual, needs to individuate. You look at where you came from, you look at what happened before, and you ask yourself, what happened before that was good? Because that was good, I want to even do better and pass that on to the next generation. But that wasn't so good, maybe we should cut the cord and not pass that one on. And so a lot of us, you look at the history of your family, the history of your sex, your sexuality, your race, your culture, your religion, and those things can be extremely important. However, there's a way in America today that we need to come out of our silos. You know, in alchemy, there's this concept of separatio. You separate out all the elements to perfect them, but you perfect them so that they can then come back together at a higher level. So I want to talk to you tonight, not just as a Black American, white American, Jewish American, Christian American, Muslim American, gay American, straight American, Gen Z, or older American. I want to talk to you tonight as an American. I don't care if you're 18 or you're 80, I'm talking to you. Because we have to go into that place after the hyphen and have a very serious conversation. And hopefully I'll convince you why I think it's so important. Let's go back to 1776, because that's where it all began. In 1776, some very brave men, 56 of them, as a matter of fact, signed a document, the Declaration of Independence. The signing of that document literally changed the world, because it infused into the ethers of human possibility something that had never been articulated or declared before. Principles which would form the founding core of our nation, principles which have never been fully actualized, they've never been fully manifest. But the very fact that they were declared in that document would mean that the possibility would theretofore exist. They were radical principles. They were radical principles in 1776, and they are radical principles today. Now, I pointed out that these 56 men were very brave, and they were because if the British had won the war, they would have all been executed. They would have been hanged as traitors against the King of England. Now, in the Jewish religion, it says that every generation must rediscover God for itself. And every generation of Americans needs to rediscover the principles at the core of the Declaration of Independence for ourselves. We know that they're inscribed on marble walls. We know that they're written in parchment, underneath glass, in museums in Washington. We might send our 8th grade kids to Washington on a field trip to see it someday, and we think that's enough. It's not enough. Because if these principles are no longer inscribed on our hearts, then they lose their moral force. We talk about them abstractly. We think of them in terms of relevance for other generations, but we're not truly claiming for ourselves by asking ourselves, what is their relevance for us? And when we do, we see not only that these principles establish profound rights, but also establish profound responsibilities for you and me, for every generation to recognize that this treasure has been placed in our hands. And it is our responsibility to protect these principles from encroachment, undermining, sabotage, or assault from anyone and anything, whether here or elsewhere, to expand these principles to the best of our ability in our time, and hand them to the next generation fortified, even strengthened, and expanded more than they were when we received them. Now, as I said before, these principles were radical, and they form our North Star. They are our vision statement. They're our radar. They are what Abraham Lincoln referred to as an eternal rebuke against all systems of tyranny and oppression. And John Adams said that he hoped that every year we would revisit them. Number one, all men are created equal. Radical then, radical now. Number two, all men endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. We call that self-actualization today. It means you were given by God the right, go for it. Do it, whatever it is. Be happy, whatever makes you happy. Fly high, spread your wings. As long as you don't hurt anyone else, it's your inalienable right. Number three, just gets more radical. Government is instituted to secure those rights, not undercut or diminish or chip away at, but to secure those rights. And number four, most radical of all, if the government is not doing that job, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. Now, I mentioned that 56 men signed that document. This is where it all got started. Philosophically, morally, even spiritually, as well as politically, this was a great burst of possibility and light in the ethers of humanity. But that's also where things got gnarly. We all know our American history. It's not just that. Out of the 56 signers, 41 of them were slave owners. 41 of them were slave owners, which means that from the very beginning, always, in our American consciousness, baked into the cake, in our characterological DNA, America has always been, from the beginning, and in every generation since then, including ours, the best and the worst of what humanity has had to offer. To own that, to recognize that struggle, to see that that's our story, is profoundly empowering, because you begin to recognize your own role in dealing with that story and writing the chapter in that story in our own time. So that struggle between people who got, this is big, that anybody, no matter who they are, should have a shot, should have a chance. This is so big. There are people in our history, and there are people among us today, hopefully everyone here, willing to sacrifice, willing to struggle, and at times we're willing to die in order that those principles might be kept alive. But there have always been, in our history from the very beginning, once again, every single generation living out the same struggle, there have also been those who, for their own ideological and or financial purposes, had no intention whatsoever of allowing those principles to be actualized, did not want those principles made manifest, and have proven over and over again that they would do whatever it takes to make sure that they were not. So you ask yourself, well, how have we handled it ever since the beginning? Every generation lives out this struggle, this drama, some more dramatically than others. But if you actually look at other generations and how they handle these things, it is extremely impressive. Yes, we had slavery in this country, but a generation rose up with abolition, with the Civil War, with constitutional amendments abolishing the institution of slavery. We had the institutionalized suppression of American women, and a generation rose up with the women's suffragist movement, passed the 19th Amendment, and gave women the right to vote. We had the first Gilded Age and the financial inequities thereof, and the original labor movement was formed as a generation rose up with organized labor as an antidote to that kind of financial injustice. We also had the institutionalized suppression and oppression of black people in the American South in the form of segregation, and a generation rose up with the civil rights movement, with desegregation, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the passing of the Civil Rights Act. I've been running for president for over a year now because it's our turn now. Now, in our generation, it's not a specific institutional reality. It's not a specific institutional thing that we simply have to excise or abolish. There's not like one thing to do. Rather, the problem is an economic paradigm. It's simply a thought that has actually replaced democracy as our governing principle. It's the very idea that short-term profits for huge corporate entities, for some reason, should supersede the focus on your health, on your well-being, on your safety, on your children, on your planet, and on the planet's future. Let us not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to say no to stuff like that. Now, some people say all of this started in the 70s. Some people say it actually started in the 80s. It certainly became full-blown in the 80s. The idea of trickle-down economics, the idea that all that a corporation should be responsible for. And for those of you who are younger, I want to say something that those of us who are older, I know you might not believe this, but we grew up in a time where actually the social consensus was that the corporation was supposed to care. But back in the 80s, it was like, no, they shouldn't even have to. The job of the corporation should simply be to increase stockholder value. So there's the stockholders, but then there are other stakeholders. There are the people who work in that corporation. There's the community, the neighborhood, the environment. But this was an idea that no. All it should be about is stockholder value and CEO value. And then, so the narrative wins, these people would be job creators. And all of that money, oh my goodness, it would be so wonderful. All that money would trickle down and it would lift all boats. Well, 50 years later, we certainly can see that that's not what happened. There's been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% of the American people. What happened is that millions of people were thrown off the boats they were already on. Millions of people were left in the ocean of despair without even a life vest. And that's because the business model of these newly formed stockholder class, their business model was never job creation. Their business model was job elimination and worker exploitation and union busting and demonization and tax cuts for the very, very rich. What has occurred, in addition to that $50 trillion transfer of wealth, is the largest income inequality in 100 years in this country. Now, this is something else I want to say to you young'uns here. I'm going to tell you something, and once again, the older people in the room are going to say, oh, she's right or not. Now, those of you who are young probably intellectually know that what I'm saying is true, but I'm sure for many of you it's like hard to even believe it. I want to describe to you a land long ago, far away. It was called the 1970s. You ready? Let me describe that land to you. The average American couple could afford a house. The average American couple could afford a car. The average American couple, family, could afford a yearly vacation. In that average American couple, if they chose, one parent could stay home and be with the kids. And that average American couple, 4 people, could be supported on one salary, and that average American couple could afford to send their kids to college. You know what that was called? A thriving middle class. You cannot have a thriving democracy where there's no thriving middle class. The late Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, "You can either have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy. You cannot have both." And so short-term profits for this huge matrix of corporate behemoths has replaced democracy. It's our new bottom line. It's our new governing principle. It has infected every corner of American society. It has left 20% of us doing fine. 20% of us doing fine is like saying all the blood in the body is going to be in your arms. Blood has got to circulate in the body, and financial opportunity has got to circulate in the society. Otherwise, what happens is what's happened. When Abraham Lincoln went to the battlefield at Gettysburg, and he said that the men who had died there for the Union had given their last full measure of devotion, so that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. And I'm here tonight so that we can consider together that it's perishing now. We are not functionally a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We're a government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. And especially since the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court decision 14 years ago that gave unlimited permission to these corporate forces to so unduly influence our government. It has turned Washington into a system of legalized bribery, and in issue after issue after issue, our legislators do more to serve the profit-making goals of their donors than to serve the issue of safety, health, and well-being, even when fully expressed by their own constituents. That's where we are now. Washington, D.C. has been turned into a system of legalized bribery, and that system will not disrupt itself. That's our job. We need to intervene. Now, this business of looking to a political party to handle all this, abolition didn't come from a political party that was major. It came from the Abolitionist Party. And women's suffrage came from the Women's Party, just like Social Security came from the Socialist Party. Political parties are not even mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. And in his farewell address, George Washington warned us about political parties. He said that they would become factions of men who were more loyal to their party than to their country. John Adams, also our second president, said that he feared they were the biggest threat to democracy. Now, as I said before, there's this huge behemoth of corporate powers. There's a corporate matrix. There are these corporate overlords, the land of the oligarchs. It's insurance companies, big pharmaceutical companies, big food companies, big chemical companies, big agriculture companies, gun manufacturers, big oil, fossil fuel extraction interests, and the military-industrial complex. Now, I used to think that something like the political parties chopped wood and carried water for that behemoth of corporate forces. I've now realized, no, they are among them. They are a corporate force. And that's why I mentioned the political media industrial complex. And I also mentioned at the very beginning tonight, that's not a conduit for the deepest conversation we need to be having. That's an obstruction to the deepest conversation that we need to be having. And I've also found, having run for president twice now, but this year, this time, much more than last time, because this time they knew how serious I am. That's why they call me unserious. This time, they made it very clear to me that they will do whatever is necessary in order to keep away from the center of power any conversation that does not align with their corporate-backed agenda. They use character assassination, they kick you off ballots, they make everything so expensive that only someone who has access to huge amounts of wealth can get anywhere near the pinnacles of power. They do what they have to do to convince you that you're free because you get to vote for whoever you want to vote for, but they have every plan in the world and they're good at it. They will curate just who that should be. And they will make sure that only who they believe should be one of the people that you vote for has any chance of being heard or known by you. Now, given that, if anybody is going to say, oh, this is just ridiculous, I'm done with it, forget it. I didn't say that, or I said it for a couple weeks. And I got back because I realized that even though there is a temptation for all of us to just right now, given the state of this country and given the state of this world, it's like you just want to get in bed and put the covers over your eyes and say, just wake me up when it's over. That's what they want us to feel. Cynicism is just an excuse for not helping. Don't you know, it's like when people say to me, oh, it's so traumatizing. Don't you think the people who walked across the bridge at Selma were traumatized? You talk about being anxious? Are you kidding? What about the women who were thrown into prison and all that their crime was that they had marched for suffrage? They were thrown into prison and the conditions in the prison were so horrible that they went on a hunger strike, and the response of the prison officials to their hunger strike was to send men into the cells and to force feed them with these metal contraptions around their neck. Don't you think they might have been a little anxious? You know what my message is to my generation, and my generation, when I say it, as I said before, I don't care if you're 18, I don't care if you're 80, we're the adults. Toughen up, buttercups. We have a country to save. This is not a moment for us to be asking each other, are you okay? How's your wounding today? How bad is it for you today? Listen, I wrote those books. I know those books have value, but we have taken it too far, and we have to stop coddling that in ourselves. We need to stop coddling it in each other, and we need to get used to saying things like, what great thing you got planned today, and how can I help? And that's what each and every one of us need to get used to. You know, Martin Luther King said, we need quantitative changes in our circumstances, we also need qualitative shifts in our souls. In order to rise to this occasion, we have to think not only in terms of what we need to do, but we need to think in terms of who we need to be in order to even discern what it is we need to do, and in order to be able to do it. Now, just as we've talked about what happened over 200 years ago, let's talk for a moment about what's happening today. The mindset of the 21st century is different than the mindset of the 20th. The mindset of the 20th was different than the mindset of the 19th. In the 20th century, the view was very mechanistic. It was a product of Newtonian physics. The idea was that the world is a big machine. And so if you want to change the world, you just tweak the pieces of the machine. And what that did, it led to, listen, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution. It's not like there were not some great accomplishments that emerged from that. But there was also a great forgetfulness that set in, a forgetfulness that we were warned about by the American Transcendentalists, by Walt Whitman, Emerson, people like that, Thoreau. The imbalance, however, occurred. And around the change of the century into the 21st, a British physicist named James Jeans said, well, it turns out the world is actually not one big machine. The world is one big thought. Because with this mechanistic perspective that was so dominant in the 20th century, the mind, particularly of Westerners, was just focused so in such an unbalanced way on that which was external rather than internal. That meant the primacy of consciousness was given no focus whatsoever, which means by definition, you're going to focus on a symptom, but not even think about root cause. I also want to point out right now, Gen Z are not 20th century people. For Gen Z, we've got a younger generation of Americans who were not even born in that century. Or if they were born there, it was just to learn how to walk. They are 21st century people. 21st century is a very different mindset, holistic, integrative, seeking a rebalance of external and internal factors. That's why there's been the kind of shift in mainstream medicine. Most people now, you don't want just an allopathic healer. People want a functional medicine doctor, an energy medicine doctor. We have an integrative approach to healing the body now. We know that it's not enough to not try to cultivate health, to simply wait then. Sickness happens, and you're going to go to some allopathic doctor who will seek external remedies to suppress or eradicate symptoms. We've moved on when it comes to the body. We know that we have to proactively create health, that sickness is the absence of health. Health is not the absence of sickness. And so we seek integrative leaders in medicine. We need integrative leaders in politics. People who realize that symptoms had a root cause, who realize that you can't not provide justice, not provide health care, not provide education, not provide economic opportunity, and then when everything falls apart, which of course it will, just build more prisons or drop more bombs and say, well, that'll fix it. Those people, I'm sorry, they need to retire now. Now, it's not like we don't have solutions. That's the thing. It's not like there's any area, and every area is so wounded because of these tentacles of this malevolent strain of unfettered, soulless capitalism. Now, remember, when capitalism, free market capitalism, was first articulated by a man named Adam Smith, Adam Smith said, free market capitalism cannot work outside an ethical context. It's like we were talking about before. You've got to have your brain and your heart. Anything, whether it's in your personal life or our collective lives. You can't leave out love. You can't leave out compassion. You can't leave out justice. You can't leave out mercy. You can't leave out character. You can't leave out ethics. You can't leave out loyalty and not expect life to stop working. Now, on an individual basis, everybody here knows that. Everybody knows that. You got to be a nicer person or things aren't going to work for you. You're going to have to learn to forgive. You're going to have to learn to be a compassionate presence. You're going to have to learn to be someone that inhabits a space that makes people, that is, as John was saying, you become a harmonizing agent. Well, our collective policies should be the same. That's all that politics is. It's our collective expression of trying to make the world a more beautiful place. That's what it should be. And there are people in every area. There are people having to do with energy, having to do with medicine, having to do with education, having to do with business, having to do with agriculture. There are people who are ready to move on. We got it. We got the new organic, sustainable ways of doing it. This is the problem. The people with solutions are over here. People with power are over here. Because the people with solutions don't have the power, and the people with the power don't really want to hear the solutions. I mean, maybe they'll have them over for a panel, and maybe even have them sit next to the first lady or something like that at a speech. But they don't really want to let them in the room. Because the people with the power are still ensconced in a 20th century model of politics whose bottom line has to do with the enabling of the system that is causing the problems. So, at this point, you've got people who are providing solutions. They're in nonprofit organizations trying to do it and having fundraisers. We might raise $50,000. And then the people with all the power over here say, that's so nice that you raised $50,000, while they're giving $50 million subsidies to the people who are causing the problems. Now, remember what I talked about before when I said, if you don't take the Declarations of Independence, if you don't take the words of Lincoln, if you don't take the words of Roosevelt, if you don't realize, hey, that's supposed to mean me. That's supposed to be me. All of us are supposed to be driving this car. This car isn't supposed to be owned by anyone. It's owned by everyone. There's such a radicalism to that. But we are heirs to that. But what has happened is we have allowed for this political class. I thought that's the kind of entitlement and aristocratic stuff we repudiated in 1776. We have to repudiate it again. Because what happens is if you don't take these principles into your own heart, we become easy to play. And that's what's happened for the last 50 years. We've been played. And so the real dichotomy is not between left and right. The real dichotomy is between the powerful and the powerless. The real dichotomy is between those who have wealth and access to ever more wealth versus those who are just struggling to get by. Now, when we talk about the new way of thinking, that includes a new way of listening. So I'm going to say some things, and once again, please don't just hear them with your head. Hear them with your heart. And I'm not assuming I'm saying anything here tonight that everybody doesn't already know. I might be throwing out a statistic or two you hadn't heard. But this is not, we're not living in an America today where anybody in this room is going, oh, I had no idea. These are the things that all of us know. You know, I read an article about myself years ago, and I remember I read this line and I had chuckled, and I think it applies as much today as it did years ago when it was just talking about my spiritual work, but also applies to politics. This journalist said, Marianne Williamson isn't saying what everybody isn't saying. She just says it when the microphone is on. So once again, I'm not saying anything we don't already know, but let us together tonight think about these things with our heart. 39% of Americans report regularly skipping meals in order to pay their rent. Throughout poor neighborhoods in the United States, and there are far too many of them, people are selling their blood plasma. Millions of people are selling their blood plasma in order to pay their rent. 1 in 4 Americans live with medical debt. 68,000 Americans die every year from lack of health care. 18 million Americans cannot afford the prescriptions that their doctors give to them, because 75 to 90 million are either uninsured or underinsured. Millions of people have the insurance that enables them to go to the doctor, but the insurance doesn't cover the tests that the doctor wants them to have, doesn't cover the operation that the doctor wants them to have. No other advanced democracy lacks universal health care. We've been just trained to expect too little. It's an abusive relationship that we don't even realize we're being abused. Not only does every other advanced democracy have universal health care, every other advanced country, even those who aren't democracies, have it. None of them have people putting GoFundMe pages on the internet to pay for a life-saving operation of their own child or themselves or their loved one. None of those countries have 1.3 million Americans rationing their insulin. We have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Living wage in any major city in the United States is over $20. We have a third of America's workforce living on less than $15 an hour. Half of them cannot find a place to live. As I said before, 20% of us are doing fine in today's economy. So when you turn on any of those news programs and they say, well, the economy is good, that's who the economy is good for. It's good for 20% of us. But that 20%, it's like we're living on an island that is surrounded by a vast sea of human despair. What has happened to us? That we think that what government is going to save us? Our government is what created this. But our government, we cannot afford to just turn our eyes. You know, in my career, and it's been a 40-year career, I've had the privilege of being very up close and personal with people who were living through times of crisis. Someone had gotten the test results back from the doctor and it was not good news. Someone had lost a loved one. Someone found out that their child was addicted to heroin or whatever it was. So I've had a lot of experience dealing with people at such times and learning a lot in my own life as well, about how to both endure and transform a time of crisis. But when my career began in the 1980s, I think it's true to say that for the people that I would meet who were going through such things, and also it was true about America at that time, a crisis was the exception, it was not the rule. What I began to realize in about the year 2000, and when you do the math, it makes sense, I began to meet more and more people for whom times of crisis were the rule and not the exception. The crisis is not just that you got a cancer diagnosis. The crisis is you don't have health care. The crisis is having to work for 3 jobs to put food on the table. The crisis of hunger in America. The crisis of every little thing that goes on in this country, it's always something. It's an environmental crisis, or it's a crisis of our democracy. Everything is a crisis. We're living at a time of permanent crisis. And the more it's a time of crisis, the more we are tempted to constrict, and we just don't even want to have to take it on. But what we need are leaders who will take it on. But a leader who will take it on, by definition at this point, has to be someone who is not part of the system as it is. To that system, a qualified president, for instance, is someone qualified to perpetuate the system as it is. To me personally, at this point, it's almost disqualifying to think that someone has been in that system so long that they cannot even see how corrupt it is at this point. They would say, and I just want to mention, John had already mentioned, I'm not here tonight because if you vote for me, I will be the Democratic nominee. I'm in the middle of the belly of the beast. I see how the system is engineered. I see how it's manipulated. I get it. And I get that the nominee, the Democratic nominee, has already been chosen. I ask you, please, to consider voting for me in your mail-in process sometime between May 1st and May 21st. Not in order that I would become the nominee, but just so that I could help to inconvenience some people who really deserve to be inconvenienced. Werner Erhard said, you can live your life one of 2 ways. You can live your life out of circumstances, or you can live your life out of a vision. Now, when it comes to our collective life, we're always playing whack-a-mole. It's a problem here. Maybe we can tweak that. Maybe we can tweak that. But the issues are not always the issue. The issue is the underlying issues, the root causes. And so much of the root cause of so much misery and so much desperation that leads to so much dysfunction, malfunction, and violence in this society and in this world has to do with economic despair. And that is why we must have economic justice. No wealthy person, no good person in this country wants to feel like we're creating wealth at the expense of other people having the opportunity. That's not what's supposed to happen in this country. What's supposed to happen in this country, which is provided by adequate health care, provided by adequate access to education and so forth, is that is the goal, which is that anybody who works hard should have a shot. And that's why we need an economic bill of rights. We need to have a vision. And that's why in being here, in continuing to campaign, I want to just impact the political ethers with a vision of possibility so that we can begin to live into that. We should have an economic bill of rights. And everything that I'm about to mention to you, let me be very clear, is considered a moderate position in every other advanced democracy. We should have universal health care, improved Medicare for all. That should include eyeglasses and hearing aids and dental and mental health. Moderate position in every other advanced democracy. We should use the Higher Education Act to completely obliterate those college loan debts because they should never have existed. Before the 1970s, we had tuition-free college and tech school. We had a system at University of Florida, University of Texas, University of California. That's why when I was mentioning the 1970s, the average American couple could afford to send their kids to college. the way the tentacles of this particular malevolent strain of unfettered soulless capitalism works is it's like a heat-seeking missile for wherever there's a profit center. Where is there most likely to be a profit center? Where people are desperate for something. People are desperate for their insulin, jack up that price. What else are they desperate for? Well, the kids are desperate to get an education. Yeah, you're right, because they were told that you get an education, you're more likely to be able to actualize your dreams. This is particularly immoral, what was done to young people of color, because young people of color were told that if you get an education, that's the way to close the wage gap. And so right now, and now I want to say to those of you who are older, okay? Those of you who are older in the room, please do this for me. Imagine for a moment who you were when you were in your 20s. Got it? Please look at that person. Could you, who you were in your 20s, have been able to handle tens of thousands of dollars of college loan debt? Would you be who you are today? I mean, debt is crippling at any age. 20s are hard in any generation. And by the way, kids, they're not a mental illness, but they are hard. But if you add to that tens of thousands of college loans, and more in some cases, that they got for no other reason than that they're trying to get in the game, they're trying to self-actualize. You know, some people say that this country should be run like a business. That's hogwash. It should be run like a fiscally responsible family. You set your young people up to win. You don't cut them off at the knees. We should also have subsidized childcare. Childcare is a crisis for couples throughout America. We should have subsidized childcare. We should have paid family leave. We should have tuition-free college and tech school. We should have guaranteed sick pay. We should have jobs guarantee, and we should have guaranteed living wage. Once again, all of those considered moderate positions in every other advanced democracy. We should also have a cabinet-level Department of Peace. Just like sickness is the absence of health and health isn't the absence of sickness, war and violence are the absence of peace, not the other way around. I already mentioned how we just don't even, you know, it's like when Martin Luther King said there are two kinds of peace, positive peace and negative peace. He said negative peace is where there's no outright expression of violence, but there's an underlying tension and anxiety. He said we could only have positive peace if it's predicated on brotherhood and justice. So we right now, instead of doing that, as I said, we just take the allopathic remedy of building more prisons and dropping more bombs because that just feeds the corporate behemoth machine of profit-making anyway. We should have a Department of Peace because we should have a military academy. Just like we have a military academy, we should have a peace academy. Just like we have armies of military personnel, we should have armies of peace builders. Just like we play war games, we should play peace games. We should envision this planet 100 years from now without war and reverse engineer from there. John F. Kennedy said we would get rid of war, or war would get rid of us. I have a lot of respect, actually, for the U.S. military. The problems that we have seen so often in our lifetimes have had to do with the commanders-in-chief, much more than it's had to do with the military itself. I look at the military like I look at a surgeon. If you're going to have surgery, you want to have the best surgeon. And the United States needs the best surgeon, and we need the best surgeon on hand at all times. But a reasonable person tries to avoid surgery if necessary. So we need to put our focus on creating peace. And peace building is, I think a lot of people don't realize this, peace building is an actual expertise. It's an actual set of skills. And it's predicated on 4 factors. And these 4 factors statistically indicate this could be in a corner of an American city or it could be in another corner of the world. When these factors are present, there will be a higher incidence of peace and a lower incidence of violence. Number one, expanded economic opportunities for women. Number two, expanded educational opportunities for children. Number three, a reduction of violence against women. And number four, the amelioration of unnecessary human despair. Large groups of desperate people should be seen as a national and international security risk because they form a petri dish out of which all manner of personal and societal dysfunction is almost inevitable. That's why all public policy should be built around one core principle. Does it help people thrive? You want to build a great economy, help people thrive. And for those of you who are older, remember when we were young, politicians used to say all the time, for peace and prosperity. They don't even say it anymore. And it's not like they don't say it anymore because it's a cliche. They don't say it anymore because they think we might be on to them if they said it. Because if their real goal is peace and prosperity, why are you doing this and why are you doing that? We also need to end America's drug war. And I know you've had your experiences here in Oregon. I know that you decriminalized and then recriminalized, but unless I'm mistaken, and I hope that somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, those of us in other parts of the country have witnessed what happened here, and the assumption has been that it was done without the appropriate wisdom and responsibility in terms of harm reduction and so forth. So the issue is that in 1971, Richard Nixon began the war on drugs. At that time, I want to point out that there were 300,000 people incarcerated in the United States. Today, there are 2.3 million. And 46% of all federal prisoners in the United States carceral system are nonviolent drug offenders. That's also a big issue of color, because white people and black people in America use drugs at roughly the same rate, but you don't have policemen raiding white neighborhoods to see who's using drugs here. And you have, in addition to that, the fact that a black person in America, a person of color in the United States, if they are convicted and sentenced for a crime, they are on the average given 20% more time in prison than if a white person committed the same crime. We spent $1 trillion on the war on drugs. It clearly has not solved the problem. It has exacerbated it. What we don't need a drug czar, we need a recovery czar. For the $100 billion that we spend every year on the drug war, we could fund a world-class network of drug recovery options. What we need to do with drugs in the United States is like they do in countries such as Portugal, treat it as a health issue and not a criminal issue. And I know that Oregonians are very clear, both the upside and the downside of doing things the way we do them now. Whether it has to do with the Department of Peace, whether it has to do with the Department of Children and Youth in order to face the extraordinary risks to our children. I think young children are the biggest collateral damage of this malevolent economic system to which people are in service to our economic system, and the economic system is supposed to be in service to people. But little children are old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. They're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. And so their needs are routinely neglected. We have little kids who are traumatized before preschool. We know that 90% of the brain is developed in the first 5 years. If I were president, one of the first things I would do is convene the best minds in America on everything related to early childhood. We have millions of American children who cannot even learn to read by the time they're 10 because the schools don't have the resources to enable them to have learned that. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 10, the chances of high school graduation are drastically reduced and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. If we want to have an America that's truly sustainable and repaired and part of a new beginning in America 20 years from now, we need to make a massive transfer of resources into the lives of children under 10 right now. And I'm sure with the extraordinary land that you have out in Oregon, nobody doubts here the importance of ramping down rather than ramping up fossil fuel extraction. And that means if it has to mean declaring a climate emergency, we should declare a climate emergency. You and I are living at a time where presidents, no matter whether they're Democrats or Republicans, line up and do the bidding of big oil. Even the president who calls himself a climate president and who we should appreciate for the very beneficial investments in green energy that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a classic purse thief distraction technique here. Because even though there's been greater investment in green energy, there's been even greater investment in dirty. This administration has given more oil drilling permits than even Trump did, plus approved the Willow Project and so forth. We've simply got to have a mass mobilization for a just transition from a dirty economy to a clean economy, just like we need a just transition from a war economy to a peace economy. Now, given everything that I've already talked to you about tonight, I'm sure it doesn't surprise you why my presence as a candidate has not been particularly appreciated. But I also want to point out to you, I'm a big girl. I'll be fine. I have a life. But you need to know, this is not okay. It's not okay that CNN blacklisted me this time. It's not okay that MSNBC blacklisted me. And don't think it doesn't have to do with the fact that the pharmaceutical companies and everything else, defense contractors and so forth, who are their advertising base. Because it is a political media industrial complex at this point. The only people that they consider qualified are people qualified to perpetuate, as I said, the system as it is. I'd like to point out to you what our founders said made a person qualified to be president of the United States. In the Constitution, it says that in order to be president, someone has to have been born here, someone has to have lived here for 14 years, and someone has to be 35 years old or older. It does not say that person had to have been a governor or a senator or a congressperson. It doesn't. And they did that for a reason. They were leaving it to you and me to determine what skill set and what expertise at any particular time is most required in order to lead us facing the challenges that we face at any particular time. We don't need another political car mechanic. We have plenty of those. The problem is we're on the wrong road. The problem is not that we need another technocrat. We need a visionary at this time. And I'm not the greatest visionary in the United States, but I'll tell you, I'm the only one that's been running for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. Now, a lot of people have said to me over the last year, Marianne, how could you do this? What are you thinking? Don't you understand there are fascists at the door? I've been doing this because I realize there are fascists at the door. And I realize they should never have gotten so close. And Franklin Roosevelt said that we would never have to worry about a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivered on its promises. That's the problem. Democracy is not delivered on its promises. Democracy delivering on its promises means that there would be no person worrying about health care for them or their children in this country. Democracy delivering on its promises means that higher education, nobody would have to worry for themselves or for their children whether such things were available. Democracy delivering on its promises means that everyone knew they work hard, there's a job available where they could live a good, dignified life on one salary. Democracy delivering on its promises means that more than 20% of us are cared about in terms of the things in life that are necessary in order to avoid the chronic stress and anxiety that now 70% of Americans say that they experience. Chronic economic anxiety. Chronic economic anxiety. And then the system calls it a mental health crisis. When I lived in Michigan, a U.S. senator said, Miss Williamson, do you have any idea what we should do about the mental health crisis? You know what I responded to her? Yeah, stop driving everybody crazy. How can people live day after day, month after month, year after year, knowing that they're just on the edge? A majority of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. A majority of Americans cannot absorb a $1,000 unexpected expenditure. This is unsustainable. This is going to blow. This is going to blow. There's too much rumbling underneath the surface. People can feel it right now. You can feel it with something's rumbling under the surface, and it's going to blow in one direction or the other. It's either going to lead to a rebirth of freedom, an expanded sense of democracy and what's possible in this country, and a rededication to that, and a renewed sense in all of us that we are responsible for this, that this is our time, that we must show up for this, each of us, not just in Washington, but in Salem, not just in a city, but in a state, and in Washington. All of us must realize that in this time, we must begin to see activism in the world, as well as the spiritual internal activism, as simply a layer of a well-lived, meaningful life. And if it does not fall in that direction, it will fall in another direction of chaos, dystopia, violence, and possibly authoritarianism such as we have never seen. This is a very serious moment, and we need to be very serious people. We often say that it's so sad, so tragic, when a child never gets a chance to be a child. Well, I also think it's pretty pathetic when an adult never gets around to being an adult. And it's our time. This is not a time for men to act like boys, not a time for women to act like little girls. It's not a time for any of us to think, I'll become more emotionally and psychologically and intellectually sober later when I've worked out this issue or worked out that issue. The people who have done great things in our past, in this country and around the world, they weren't perfect. They weren't any less wounded than we are. They weren't any less hurt than we are by certain circumstances. But they found their meaning in showing up. And that's where we are going to find our meaning as well. Once again, Martin Luther King, external and internal change. He said that the desegregation of the American South was the political externalization of the goal of the civil rights movement. But the ultimate goal is the establishment of the beloved community. It's not one or the other, it's both and. I have a personal motto. It's a formula that really helps me. So I want to submit it to you. It might be helpful to you as well. You might want to tweak the language depending on what kind of internal work you do, what kind of attitude you have about change, both inside and outside. But it works for me, so I'll give it to you. Pray in the morning, kick ass in the afternoon. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.